Israel uses its missiles to protect its children. Hamas uses children to protect its missiles. This is Nadine Awad, a 16-year-old girl, an Arab citizen of Israel. She was studying biology and chemistry, and she dreamed of changing the world. She was murdered last Wednesday by the radical jihadi terrorist group Hamas. A Hamas rocket slammed into her home in central Israel, killing her and her father. Over the last week, millions of Israeli children, women, and men have been huddling in bomb shelters, while thousands of Hamas rockets landed all around them. Hamas has murdered 10 people in Israel, Jews and Arabs, and hundreds of its rockets have fallen short upon the people of Gaza itself, killing Palestinian children and destroying Palestinian homes. Hamas is carrying out its terror attacks while hiding behind Palestinian houses, schools, and hospitals, deliberately using civilians as human shields. Just before I arrived here today, I called my elderly parents who live in the southern city of Ashkelon and have just 30 seconds to reach a bomb shelter each time Hamas attacks. Member of the Security Council, let me ask you, what would you do if thousands of terrorist rockets were being fired at your country, at your people, at your parents or children? How would you respond if an organization with a similar fanatic jihadist ideology as ISIS was bombing Beijing or Moscow or Dublin and shutting down the airports of Paris or Oslo or London? What would you expect the Security Council to do? Mr. President, this is not the first time that Hamas has indiscriminately fired deadly missiles at Israeli civilians while hiding behind Palestinian civilians. But this time, it's different. It was completely premeditated by Hamas in order to gain political power. It was all a part of their vicious plan. While Hamas seeks the destruction of the state of Israel, it's also vying to take power in the West Bank and to replace the Palestinian Authority. Hamas was frustrated last month when President Abbas postponed Palestinian elections after not holding them for 15 years. It looked for another way to seize power. So, unfortunately, it chose to escalate tensions in Jerusalem as a pretext to start this war. Suddenly, Hamas leader Mohammed Def, who has been silent for years, was threatening Israel would pay a heavy price if an Israeli court went ahead and ruled on a property dispute in Jerusalem. Now let me be clear. Israel is a country of law with a robust and independent judiciary. As in any democracy, the Israeli government does not interfere with court proceedings. Everyone knows that. Buying into Hamas's political propaganda ploy to portray the massive, unprovoked rocket attacks as a result of the dispute in Sheikh Jarrah is not only wrong, it is dangerous. It sends a disturbing message. There is never an excuse to indiscriminately fire rockets at civilians. There is never a justification for terror. Do you really believe that this property dispute is what caused Hamas to launch these large-scale attacks on the people of Israel? So after threatening Israel over Sheikh Jarrah, Hamas's next move was to incite violence on the Temple Mount, the holiest site in the world for Jews and one of the holiest for Muslims. Palestinian extremists turned the Al-Aqsa Mosque into a site for stockpiling weapons and launched violent attacks with firebombs and rocks against Jewish worshippers and against the Israeli police. Here is a photo of the stones and other weapons which Palestinian rioters placed in Al-Aqsa, desecrating this holy site and endangering the safety of all worshippers. The Israeli police had no choice but to intervene to restore order and ensure that both Jewish and Muslim worshippers could pray in peace. Using non-lethal means, our police was able to disperse the violent riots without a single fatality. Without a single fatality. I doubt whether there are many police forces anywhere in the world that could have achieved such an outcome. I want to emphasize, Israel deeply cherishes freedom of religion. Every year, during Ramadan and throughout the year, hundreds of thousands of Muslims are free to pray at their holy site in peace. Even after these extremely violent riots, Israel remains committed to the status quo and to religious freedom for all. Here is another photo of Eid al-Fitr prayers from this past Thursday, showing tens of thousands of Muslims praying at Al-Aqsa. Do you really believe these peaceful prayers is what caused Hamas to launch this large-scale attack on the people of Israel? Israel will continue to uphold the rights of all believers to practice their religion in freedom and security in the holy city of Jerusalem. As opposed to Hamas, which did everything in its power to incite violence, Israel took all possible steps to de-escalate tensions in Jerusalem. In an extremely exceptional move, we made a request to the Supreme Court to delay its hearing on the Sheikh Jarrah case. We rerouted our annual Jerusalem Day Parade and even took the unprecedented, unthinkable step of preventing Jews from entering their holiest site, the Temple Mount, on our National Day of Celebration. Even today, on the eve of the Jewish festival of Shavuot, where we celebrate receiving the Torah, Jews were prevented from entering the site because of Palestinian terror. And how did Hamas respond to all our efforts to de-escalate? By firing rockets and missiles at Jerusalem, our capital city. This is how it started. It was all planned in advance. Mr. President, for years Hamas has been using international aid not to help the people of Gaza, but to abuse them. It has built a vast web of underground terror tunnels which snake beneath playgrounds, maternity wards, and mosques with the clear strategic goal of increasing the number of Palestinian civilian casualties when Israel is forced to respond. It is not just Palestinians which Hamas uses as shields. As we have revealed, Hamas is hiding its terror infrastructure such as intelligence stations and command headquarters in multi-story buildings, including those which house international media, citizens of your own countries. Israel has no choice but to stop these Hamas attacks wherever they are being launched, and it is Hamas who should be held accountable for the consequences. We thank the President of the United States, the administration, and the many other countries that support Israel's right to defend our citizens from this terror. every time Hamas fires at Israeli civilians while hiding behind Gaza civilians, it is committing a double war crime. It doesn't care where its rockets hit, as long as there is destruction. It doesn't care who the victims are, as long as there are victims. Israel is responding to indiscriminate attacks with precision-targeted strikes against Hamas military targets. We take unparalleled steps to prevent civilian casualties. Not only do we strictly adhere to international law, we go beyond, making phone calls and sending text messages in order to make sure that everyone gets out beforehand. Tragically, at times, despite all our efforts, Hamas's use of human shields results in civilians getting hurt. As an Israeli, a Jew, a father of four, I am deeply pained by the death of every civilian, whether Israeli or Palestinian. But any attempt to compare Israel and Hamas is factually, legally, and morally wrong. Hamas targets civilians. Israel targets terrorists. Israel makes every effort to avoid civilian casualties. Hamas makes every effort to increase civilian casualties. Israel sees every civilian death as a tragedy. Hamas sees every Israeli civilian death as a victory in its campaign of jihad based on its anti-Semitic charter, and every Palestinian civilian death as a victory in its campaign to gain international sympathy. Israel uses its missiles to protect its children. Hamas uses children to protect its missiles. Mr. President, at the same time as we defend ourselves against Hamas rockets, the terror organization has been calling on Israel's Arab citizens to attack Jews. We have seen numerous appalling attacks by Arab citizens of Israel against Jews, including the abhorrent burning of synagogues and multiple lynchings. We have also seen some appalling cases of Jewish violence against our Arab citizens. As Prime Minister Netanyahu said last night, this violence is entirely unacceptable. We are a country of law, and the Israeli police are now working vigorously to stop the violence, arrest the perpetrators, whether Arabs or Jews. Mr. President, this is where we stand now. A massive, unprovoked assault by Hamas, initiated not as a result of any incidents involving Israel, but due to the internal Palestinian political maneuvering. This assault has forced Israel to defend and protect its citizens and strike Hamas's terror machine in order to stop their aggression once and for all. Now let me speak about the future. Israel has always sought peace. Just this year, we signed peace agreements with 4 Muslim countries. In 2005, Israel withdrew from the Gaza Strip and uprooted all the Jewish communities there in the hope it would bring security. Instead, it brought unending terror attacks by Hamas. You, the members of the Security Council, responsible for maintaining international peace and security, stand today at a critical crossroads. You have 2 choices. You can create false moral equivalence, immoral equivalence, between the actions of a democracy that sanctifies life and those of terrorist organization that glorifies death by calling for restraint on all sides and failing to unequivocally condemn Hamas. If you make this choice, it will lead to the success of Hamas's insidious strategy of firing at Israeli civilians while hiding behind Palestinian civilians. It will lead to the deaths of more innocent Israelis and Palestinians. It will lead to the strengthening of Hamas, the weakening of the Palestinian Authority, and the undermining of the chances for a dialogue. If you choose to avoid condemning Hamas, it will strengthen the radical terror group which aims to overthrow the Palestinian Authority and whose charter explicitly calls for wiping Israel off the map. It will continue the cycle of violence and undermine the chances for peace. But today, you can choose a different path. You can unequivocally condemn Hamas's indiscriminate and unprovoked attacks which threaten Israelis and Palestinians alike. You can choose to support Israel's heroic efforts to defend itself and dismantle Hamas's infrastructure of terror while doing everything to minimize the number of casualties on both sides. You can send a clear message to Hamas that the international community will no longer accept its strategy of turning Palestinian children into human shields and using schools, hospitals, and high-rises to hide its terror machines. You can choose to support a more peaceful future by demanding the demilitarization of the Gaza Strip and insisting on an authority in Gaza that invests in the well-being of the people of Gaza rather than in the destruction of the state of Israel. Israel has already made its choice. We will take all steps necessary to defend our people. Now, the choice is yours. The world is watching. Thank you.